Good evening. I'm Michael Rooks, Wayland Family Curator of Contemporary Modern Art at the High Museum, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, inspired by the High Museum's presentation of Ragnar Kjartansson, The Visitors. But before we begin, Ragnar Kjartansson, The Visitors was made possible at the High Museum by our premier exhibition series sponsor, Delta Airlines, exhibition series sponsor, Northside Hospital, premier exhibition supporters, Sarah and Jim Kennedy and Wish Foundation, benefactor exhibition supporters, Robin and Hilton Howell and the Ann Cox Chambers Foundation, the ambassador exhibition supporters, Louise Symes and Jerome Grillo, the Antonori Foundation and Corporate Environments, and also our contributing exhibition series supporters. Also to High Museum members in attendance this evening, there's so much to say about what we've lost and what we've endured in this past year, and I'm sure there's fatigue in just simply thinking about it or talking about it. But if there's one thing that I may say to those of you members tonight, it is thank you for sticking with us. You've given us purpose to keep at it this whole time, and you've made it clear how important it is to you that we provide a place of discovery and affirmation, solace, joy, fellowship, and sisterhood to the people of our city, especially when times are tough. So thank you. If you're not yet a member, or if you need to renew, please visit high.org at the end of this program. So tonight's guest is Dr. Philip Auslander. Dr. Auslander is a professor of performance studies and popular musicology at the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Institute of Technology. He is the author of numerous scholarly articles and 7 books. Among them are Presence and Resistance, Postmodernism and Cultural Politics in Contemporary American Performance, From Acting to Performance, Essays in Modernism and Postmodernism, Liveness, Performance in a Mediatized Culture, Performing Glam Rock, Gender and Theatricality in Popular Music, Reactivations, Essays on Performance and its Documentation, and his most recent book, In Concert, Performing Musical Persona. In addition to his scholarly work on performance and music, Dr. Auslander has written art criticism for Art Forum and other publications, and is a regular contributor to exhibition catalogs for museums across Europe and in North America, including the Tate Modern, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Migros Museum, and the Walker Art Center. He is also the editor of the Art Section, an online journal of art and cultural commentary, and is also a screenwriter and actor. Screen actor and writer. His short film, Dr. Blues, premiered at the Peachtree Village International Film Festival in Atlanta in October of 2019. And it is our pleasure to welcome Philip here this evening. We'll take questions at the end of the program, so you may enter those questions in the chat on your screen toward the end of tonight's program. So with that, it is again my sincere pleasure to welcome you, Philip, to our program.
Thank you, Michael, for that lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me to do this. Thanks also to Erin Doherty for making it all happen. And I'd also like to actually thank the Migros Museum, who in 2012 asked me to write a catalog essay for their show An die Musik, which was an exhibition devoted to Ragnar Kjartansson's works around music. Not all of his work has to do with music, but much of it does. And this was a show that at that point sort of brought that together. So our paths have crossed again. And I also do want to apologize in advance for any violence I may do to the Icelandic names I'm going to attempt to pronounce. If you haven't seen Icelandic performance artist Ragnar Kjartansson's The Visitors, and if you haven't seen it, you should see it by all means. It's a 9-channel video installation filmed at Rokeby, a 19th century estate in upstate New York, owned by descendants of the Astor family. Kjartansson gathered a group of friends from the Reykjavik music scene and installed them in the mansion on the estate for a week, at the end of which they filmed the videos that make up the installation in a single take. 7 of the 9 screens are mounted on the 4 walls of the gallery with 2, excuse me, 1 second. Okay. 7 of the 9 screens are mounted on the 4 walls of the gallery, with the others on each side of a freestanding wall near the center of the room. Each of eight of the screens shows a single room in the house containing, for most of the piece's 64-minute runtime, a single musician, including 3 guitarists, 2 electric and 1 acoustic, 2 pianists, one of whom doubles on bass guitar, an accordionist, a cellist, and a drummer. Although these musicians are physically separate from one another, they wear headphones that enable them to hear each other playing. Some of the musicians switch instruments. So for example, one electric guitarist also plays banjo. The accordionist switches to an acoustic guitar at a certain point, thus increasing the timbral and textural variety of the music. The 9th screen shows the porch on the outside of the house where other occupants congregate. Above each screen is a speaker through which one can hear the sound being generated by the musician on that screen. Collectively, the musicians on the interior play a single song whose lyrics derive from the poem Feminine Ways, written by Ásdís Sif Gunnarsdóttir, Kjartansson's ex-wife. At some points, the people on the porch engage in a sing-along led by a guitar player.
Once again, I fall into my feminine way. Once again, I fall into my feminine way. You protect the world from me. As if I'm the only one who's cruel. You've taken me to the bitter end. Once again, I fall into my feminine way. Once again, I fall into my feminine way.
The performance underlying the visitors was site-specific, and Kjartansson's choice of site reflects a key aspect of his work, his engagement with Romanticism. This connection is manifest in Kjartansson's use of the music of such romantic composers as Schubert and Schumann in some pieces, as well as in the melancholy sentiments often expressed in his own songs and song fragments, but he also echoes the tropes of romantic landscape painting. The 5-channel video installation, The End, Rocky Mountains of 2008, is a precursor to The Visitors. In it, the same 2 musicians, one of whom is Kjartansson, appear on each screen playing various instruments against vistas of the Canadian Rockies. The 5 tracks coalesce into a single country-flavored piece of music. The settings of the 5 videos recall the Rocky Mountain landscapes of the 19th century painter Thomas Moran and echo the romantic perception of the insignificance of the human figure when put up against the sublimity of nature. Moran was associated with the American Romanticism of the Hudson River School, an art historical movement Kjartansson references explicitly. His first visit to Rokeby in 2008 yielded the Blossoming Trees performance, for which he spent 2 days painting plein air landscapes in direct emulation of the Hudson River painters. And I love the text on this, which I'm going to read, which does a great job of giving you a sense of Kjartansson's idea of the life of the artist. The Blossoming Trees performance took the train to Rokeby Farm, upstate New York, on the 20th of June. Stayed there for 2 days, painting the trees. The sun was fierce on the first day. On the second, there was rain, thunder, and quite exquisite light. Did 7 canvases and enjoyed myself in the 19th century mansion, smoked cigars, drank beer, and read Lolita. Returned back to New York City on the 22nd. So this is the life of the artist for Kjartansson. Kjartansson's appropriations of the trappings of Romanticism is both earnest and comic. It is seldom acknowledged that the second part of the expression, from the sublime to the ridiculous, is there is but a single step. Kjartansson seems well aware that there is but a single step from the sublime to the ridiculous, and he walks the thin line between them in all of his work. The romantic landscape, whether of the Rockies or the Hudson Valley, is surely sublime, yet 2 men playing musical instruments, swathed in furs with instruments, amplifiers, and microphones set up outdoors in a wintry scene, contains more than a hint of the ridiculous, as does the figure of Kjartansson, handkerchief on his head, reenacting the plein air practices of the Hudson River painters, and the image of a man playing a plaintive and evocative song on his guitar while sitting naked and half submerged in a bathtub and raising his arms in the gestures of a rock star. Kjartansson's self-portrait as an artist, From the End, a durational performance at the 2009 Venice Biennale, encapsulates this delicate balance. He stands before us stoically, palette and brushes in his hands, gazing heavenward, the perfect image of the artist. Yet his outfit, especially the scarf and the blanket, seems makeshift, as if it were a costume scavenged from a thrift shop for a poorly funded theatrical production. There's something vaguely Harry Potterish about that scarf in particular. He presents himself to us as both the artist and as someone playing at being the artist, just as he is played at being a hillbilly musician and a plein air painter. Perhaps ludicrous would be a better word to use than ridiculous when speaking of Kjartansson. I'm well aware of this word's pejorative connotations, but the etymology of ludicrous suggests origins in the ideas of play and theatricality, both of which are central to his work. Compared with others of Kjartansson's works, both the narrative of the visitors and the musical composition at its heart are structured relatively conventionally. The narrative begins with the preparation before the musicians start performing, as a technician moves from room to room and therefore from screen to screen, setting up a microphone in each room and turning on the cameras, revealing the musician there. Once everything is in place, the musicians begin playing. The music ebbs and flows, rises and falls over the course of an hour. About 3/4 of the way through, following a delicate passage sung by sisters Gioa and Kristinana Valtisdottir, the cellist and the accordionist respectively, the music builds toward a crescendo, largely through the increasingly intense pianism of Davíð Jónsson, the Icelandic jazz musician, who is Kjartansson's primary collaborator in his music-themed performances. Just after he stops playing, seemingly exhausted, a cannon is fired outside the house. This moment marks the start of the music's final section, its coda, and what in narrative terms would be called the falling action following the story's climax. As the music resumes softly, the musicians start to leave their individual rooms and congregate in various combinations on different screens before coming together, leaving the house, and cavorting arm in arm through an open field of green grass, receding into the distance, some still holding instruments and all still singing. At the very end, the action returns to the house, where a technician moving from room to room and turning off the cameras that were turned on at the start brings about narrative closure as each screen goes to black. Whereas the narrative of the visitors has a beginning, middle, and end, Kjartansson has often isolated one or another of these moments in his performances and repeated it. Bliss, originally commissioned for the Performa Festival in 2011, consists of the final 3-minute reconciliation scene of Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro, performed in full 18th century costume on a theatrical set by professional singers joined by Kjartansson. Kjartansson is the peasant who is kind of in the middle of the screen here. He played a peasant character. They performed the final 3-minute reconciliation scene of Mozart's opera, The Marriage of Figaro, and repeated it for 12 hours. It is an ending that simply seemingly won't end until it does. In the end, of which the Rocky Mountain video was a part, Kjartansson painted portraits of a mostly nude male model for the entire 6 months of the 2009 Venice Biennale, immediately starting a new painting each time he finished one. As Marcus Thor Andresen and Dorothee Kirsch suggest in their essay for the catalog, the title, The End, appears at odds with what seems like a never-ending story. The end has no end. For God, a single-channel video work of 2007, Kjartansson, dressed in a tuxedo and fronting an orchestra against the backdrop of cheesy pink curtains, sings the line, "Sorrow conquers happiness," repeatedly for 30 minutes. If bliss is a repeated ending, which is therefore no longer an ending, God can be understood as a repeated beginning that leads to nothing. All these performances do not so much end as simply stop at a predetermined but essentially arbitrary point 30 minutes or 12 hours or 6 months after they begin. From another perspective, they do not necessarily end at all, since in 2019, Kjartansson restaged Bliss at Red Cat in Los Angeles and shot the performance for a single-channel video work of 2020. Bliss now has a history that spans a decade. The possibility of further iterations of these pieces as live performances and videos leaves open the question of whether they can ever be said to be finished. And you may notice on this slide that the piece God is dated 2007, but this image is actually of a performance of it in 2019. So it also is an ongoing thing. The Visitors is different from Kjartansson's earlier works in that it offers musical resolution and is structured as a tidy, self-contained narrative, giving the work a satisfying feeling of completion and making the ending seem like a denouement more than just a stopping point. Nevertheless, The Visitors share some features with these earlier works. The most obvious is the obsessive repetition of 2 lines from the lyrics. "Once again, I fall into my feminine ways, and the stars are exploding around you, and there's nothing you can do." Sentences that echo the romantic melancholia of sorrow conquers happiness, a melancholia that is both reinforced and undermined by the commitment and enthusiasm with which these lines are sung and performed. The other, perhaps more subtle connection has to do with the absence of finality, despite the appearance of narrative closure. Watching the merry band of musicians venturing out into nature at the end of The Visitors, their voices receding into the distance, I was reminded of Brian Eno's statement regarding the fade-outs at the end of some pop songs, a comment attributed to him by Laurie Anderson. A fade-out gives the impression that somewhere the music is still going on. It suggests an eternal music. The idea that the music goes on forever is also implicit in the opening and closing of The Visitors, the switching on and off of the cameras in each room. The successive blackouts at the screens seem to mark the end of the story pretty definitively, yet the narrative is actually cyclical. The ending mirrors the beginning in reverse. Turning on becomes turning off, and one need only turn the cameras back on to start the whole thing up again, which is exactly what happens in the gallery as the installation restarts for the next group of visitors. As an installation that takes a musical performance as its primary material, The Visitors is in dialogue with Janet Cardiff's celebrated installation, the 40-part motet of 2001, which was shown at the High Museum in 2014. Cardiff separately recorded 40 singers performing a composition by Thomas Tallis, an important 16th century English composer. The installation consists of 40 speakers on stands arranged in an oval to constitute a musical ensemble, also the way the composer intended the piece to be performed. Standing at the center of the oval, you can hear the whole ensemble, but it is also possible to move among the speakers, singling out individual voices and creating one's own mix of the recorded sound, an idea Kjartansson also embraces in The Visitors. Cardiff has said, "I'm interested in how sound may physically construct a space in a sculptural way, and how a viewer may choose a path through this physical yet virtual space." The concept of defining space through sound, musical sound in particular, is also at work in The Visitors, as is the idea of this space as sculptural. As Kjartansson puts it, I often look at my performances as sculptures and the videos as paintings. In both his and Cardiff's respective works, the sculptural effect is achieved through the way the partaker's perception of the piece changes as they move around in it, hearing the different mixes of sounds as instruments or voices move from foreground to background and are overtaken by others as one's proximity to individual musicians changes is akin to walking around a sculpture and seeing it from different angles. Just as one cannot see all sides of a sculpture simultaneously, there is no single position in the High Museum's gallery from which one can either see or hear the visitors in its entirety. You are always close enough to a particular screen to see and hear that musician's performance as dominant for that moment. Both works also create a sense of intimacy between the musicians and their audience, albeit intimacy mediated by technology. For Cardiff, this technological mediation allows the viewer to experience the connection of the human voice, but also the safety of not having to stand right next to that person. The same is true of the visitors, but to an even greater degree because of its visual dimension. Since the video images are close to life size, you can have the feeling of standing right in front of a musician in their own private space while they are performing without their being troubled by your presence. It is an opportunity to experience another person as an object of pure contemplation, free of social obligations. This distinctive combination of personal intimacy and aesthetic distance relates to Kjartansson's non-confrontational stance as a performance artist. Unlike those performance artists who challenge their audiences or place them in uncomfortable or provocative situations, Kjartansson usually retains the traditional physical distance between performers and audience in the theater. I really like the fourth wall, the comfort zone, he has said. I get embarrassed when it's broken. I like to do performance art where the viewer is in a safe zone. In Kjartansson's live performances, the viewer's safe zone begins at the edge of the performer's space, which is often a real or implied proscenium. In his video installations, the rim of the screen, a stand-in for the proscenium, demarcates the viewer's safe space. Although Cardiff isolates and abstracts the voices that make up the 40-part motet, they are not fully disembodied, since even in recorded music, in the words of musicologist Susan Fast, the performer's body is very much present in the particular sonoric gestures shaped and played in the first instance by him or her. They are human gestures, after all, through his or her body in such a way that they connect with the bodies of those listening. Additionally, the speakers and stands arrayed in the oval are distinctly anthropomorphic in appearance and scale. They are surrogates for human presence, each standing in for a specific singer. But the piece is austere. The voices may be individuated, but the uniform black figures are not. Whereas the effect of Cardiff's installation is regularly described as otherworldly, this is not a description that fits Kjartansson's work. The Visitors is very much of this world in its assertion of the physical presence of each musician as a specific individual and of the place where they are located. While Kjartansson cites artists Chris Burden and Marina Abramovich as the inspirations for his interest in durational performance, the earthiness and humor of his approach belie the asceticism and self-deprivation frequently associated with such work. In The House with the Ocean View, Abramovich lived in a spare schematic representation of 3 rooms mounted high on the wall of the Sean Kelly Gallery in New York City continuously for 12 days, fasting and performing a limited sets of repeated daily actions, sometimes regulated by the ticking of a metronome. Although the activities that make up Kjartansson's performances are just as limited and repetitious in their way as the ones in Abramovich's work, they are performed not with ritual solemnity and mortification of the flesh, but in ways that acknowledge rather than abnegate the performer's physical needs and alleviate their discomfort somewhat. To put it bluntly, no one fasts in a Kjartansson performance. Quite the contrary, food and drink are ubiquitous. In An die Musik of 2012, a performance in which pairs of formally dressed singers and pianists performed Schubert's song of that name simultaneously and repeatedly, plates of snacks and flutes of champagne perch atop the pianos. The sole activity in Variation on Meat Joy, a performance Kjartansson made for the Tate Modern's Performance Room in 2013 in reference to Carolee Schneemann's landmark work, is eating, as a group of people in 18th century costumes similar to those used in Bliss consume steak. During the 12-hour live performance of Bliss, food was delivered to both singers and musicians, who also took breaks as needed, though the performance continued in their absence. Michael H. Miller describes this aspect of the performance of Bliss at Performa. The actors were eating in shifts. Every few minutes, an attendant, dressed in the Rococo style of Mozart's opera, would enter the stage with a tray of food or a jug of water. By 7 p.m., everyone was visibly more tired. The performance started at noon and ran till midnight. By 7 p.m., everyone was visibly more tired. The oboe player handed his instrument to the man playing the flugelhorn and ran backstage, probably to pee. One of the actors lied down on her back in exhaustion, while another actor crouched down and tenderly cradled her head. They all looked excited and hopeful when an attendant brought out chocolate. The same kinds of things happen in The Visitors, albeit on a less dramatic scale, and the same casual attitude toward the formal rigors of performance prevails. The musicians rest, relax, and smoke. At one point, the drummer pulls a cold bottle of beer across his sweating forehead to cool down. Artists like Burden and Abramovich are sometimes called endurance artists. Karen Gonzalez Rice defines endurance art as performances of suffering and survival. While this definition clearly pertains to Abramovich, it is only partially applicable to Kjartansson. Many of his pieces last long periods of time and require considerable endurance on the part of performers who suffer physically, as did the singers and musicians in Bliss. But the temperament Kjartansson expresses through his work does not dwell on suffering and survival. This is admittedly too glib a formulation, but whereas Abramovich's performances are about pain, Kjartansson's ultimately are about pleasure. The pleasures of food, drink, music, fancy dress, play, art making, and good company. Whereas Abramovich's pieces end in exhaustion and catharsis, Kjartansson's end, like traditional comedies, in celebration. When the musicians and the visitors have finished playing and joined together in a single room, they light up cigars and pop open a bottle of champagne. As Jerry Saltz observes in his review, the celebration that ended Bliss included the spectators. A backstage party followed for anyone who wanted to come. Suckling pig was served, wine flowed. Excess is a hallmark of both Abramovich's and Kjartansson's work, but whereas Abramovich dwells on excesses of discipline and duress, Kjartansson's brand of excess is too much of a good thing. Too much Mozart, for example, or too much meat. Excess to the point of indulgence, as the catalog description of the performer's situation in his 2-week performance, The Schumann Machine, of 2008 demonstrates. At their disposal was an unlimited amount of cigars and champagne. Indulgence is an aspect of Kjartansson's decadent romantic view of the life of the artist that he plays at in his performances. Recall that the activities he documented for the Blossoming Trees performance were plein air painting, smoking cigars, drinking beer, and reading Lolita. Patrick Nicholson uses the word conviviality to describe Kjartansson's sensibility, and I can think of no better term. Conviviality is manifest both in the way Kjartansson works and in the relationship of his work to audiences. While many, though not all, of the most famous endurance and durational performances were performed by solo artists like Burden and Abramovich, individual sacrificial figures, Kjartansson frequently produces his work by establishing temporary artistic communities, such as himself and his model in The End, or the group of musicians he assembled for The Visitors. Set apart from the concerns of everyday life, these communities are situations in which artists can devote themselves just to making art collectively and enjoying each other's company, reflecting the romantic value of artistic autonomy. These communities are built around a 19th century conception of an artist's bohemia that now reads as deeply nostalgic, a nostalgia for a pre-corporate art world that once again is perched precariously on the border between sublimity and ridiculousness. Nicholson links the conviviality of Kjartansson's work to his use of repetition, which can prompt participation on the audience's part. In The Visitors, we hear the line, "Once again I fall into my feminine ways," sung so often to a simple but haunting melody that it is almost impossible not to want to sing it oneself, as does the group on the ninth screen, gathered on the porch for a sing-along. During A Lot of Sorrow, for which Kjartansson persuaded the indie rock band The National to perform their song Sorrow repeatedly for 6 hours at PS1 in 2013, the audience applauded enthusiastically at the end of each iteration of the song, cheered the musicians on, and clapped along. As the last notes of the final rendition of the song faded out, the audience cheered wildly with a sense of shared accomplishment. At Performer in 2011, Bliss came to a similar ending as the singers on stage sang their way through the last scene of The Marriage of Figaro for the last time. The conductor gesticulated wildly. The musicians in the pit all stood up. The audience applauded vigorously, whooped, and cheered. Whereas Abramovich seeks to achieve a powerful connection with her audience on a personal level, in The House with the Ocean View, she established eye contact with individual visitors to the gallery. Kjartansson celebrates the collective unity of performers and audience in a spirit of "we're all in this together," quite different from Abramovich's stance of "I'm doing this for you." It may be said, however, that these two artists arrive at similar places by very different routes. Abramovich intended The House with the Ocean View to be a balm for New Yorkers traumatized by the events of 9/11. Mary Richards describes it by saying, "The space within the gallery provided a haven from the complexities and complications of the rest of the world." Mark Swett, a music critic for the LA Times, described the Red Cat performance of Bliss in very similar terms. For a dozen hours, Red Cat became a Mozart safe house. The longer you stayed, the greater the effort required to leave, the outside world seeming downright threatening. The same can be said for the idyllic world of The Visitors, a carefree place where life is devoted entirely to making music with your friends that makes the real world outside the museum seem disappointing by contrast. As both Deanna Serlin in her review of The Visitors for Arts ATL and David Coucheron in a public conversation with Michael Works have already noted, there is a particular poignancy in seeing this piece now, in this time of social distancing. Like all of us at the moment, the musicians and the visitors are physically isolated, yet connected by an electronic network that enables them to join together to make something happen. Ultimately, they play out the happy ending we all hope for, the end of social distancing, the ability to come together once again, hold hands, and rejoice. But the situation of the musicians and the visitors is actually the inverse of ours. They engage in social distancing by choice rather than by obligation, and they are free to move among the rooms. They are all in the same house, but appear on individual screens. We are all in different houses, but appear on the same teleconferencing grids. The Visitors is named for the last album by the Swedish pop band ABBA, released in 1981. The cover photo for this album sleeve was taken at the preserved atelier of the Swedish painter Julius Kronberg, a 19th century interior that bears more than a passing resemblance to Rokeby. ABBA was a group built around two married couples. By the time of their final album, one of the couples had already divorced and the other was separated. Consequently, the music on the album is much darker and more introspective than ABBA's usual peppy pop confections. Although the group was frequently depicted as two happy couples, as for example on the sleeve image for their Waterloo album of 1974, the cover photo for The Visitors shows the four members as occupying the same space, but distanced from one another to reflect the state of their relationships at the time. In the final scene of The Marriage of Figaro, Count Almaviva begs his wife's forgiveness for his infidelity, which she generously grants, leading to celebration. Sweat observes that the repetition of this scene in Kjartansson's Bliss can induce us into believing that redemption, however unreceptive our current culture, is the only way of the world. By transforming the disconsolate members of ABBA, who must make music together despite their eroding relationships, into the happy band of musicians and the visitors whose isolation from one another in separate rooms of the same house belies the palpable warmth that unites them in their common love of playing music and ultimately in being together, Kjartansson performs his own act of redemption and invites us all to the party.
Philip, thank you so much for that astute analysis and elucidation of the singular installation and indeed a singular career. We have time for questions for those of you who are in the audience. As I mentioned earlier, please write them into the chat as you think of them, and I'll read them to Philip. One of the things, Philip, that came to me as a bit of a revelation, given that we are showing this correspondence between the artist and his patron, essentially, in the exhibition, is the idea of where does the performance begin and end. That correspondence lasts for a little over a year, almost every day out of a year. And when you mentioned that he's almost embarrassed when that fourth wall comes down, it made me wonder when for Ragnar Kjartansson, the performance that begins and ends for him. Is that something that you've thought about in terms of his practice?
Well, okay, yeah. Well, you mean the sort of the entire process that leads up to the performance and away from the performance? Yeah, right. I don't know. I don't know that I've run into anything that he said or such directly about it, but this is actually somewhat related to some things that I talked about in the catalog essay that I wrote, because one of the things that I discussed there and that Kjartansson has talked about is the fact that he grew up in a theatrical household, right? That both of his parents are actors or were actors, and one of the things that he talks about is being surrounded by people, who are doing the same thing over and over again, who are running lines with each other, constantly and preparing. And of course, acting is all about rehearsing and doing the same thing over and over and over again. And so I think in that sense, sort of building on that little kind of anecdote, I think that, it would make sense to suppose at least that, the performance is not just the official performance, right? It's all of the kind of preparation that leads up to it and all of the, the repetition that's involved in that preparation, which is then continued into the performance itself, so to say. And in that same essay, I mean, I also just sort of working with the idea of the theater and what it might mean to him. I also noted that we tend to think of theatrical performances as finished products. I mean, we as audience, we go to the theater, we see a thing, we see it once, and for us, it's done, right? But of course, for the point of view of the performers, it's completely different. Because that one performance is not a finished product. It's just part of a whole string of performances and before that rehearsals and so on. And, interestingly, at least, in any case, the point at which that string of events comes to an end is always arbitrary in the theater. I mean, in other words, if you have a 6-week run, okay, so it's 6 weeks. You perform until people stop coming in the commercial theater, however long that turns out to be, right? Could be 3 nights, it could be 5 years. So there's that same sense of sort of what I take anyway to be sort of the arbitrariness of the length of the performance. It's like, it could be, like I said here, it could be 3 days, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 6 months, right? And that sort of sense, and I think this is what I was also trying to get at in talking about the implicit cyclical nature of the visitors, where it ends, yes, but it will always start again. right? So that any given iteration of it is just part of a, a chain, so to say, which continues on and on and on. And I was struck when this is just something that I kind of stumbled upon when I was just looking for an image of the piece called God, which is from 2007, and yet there's Kjartansson 2 years ago performing it in Moscow, right? So it goes on and on too, and there's no, there's sort of no determinate place for it to end. So yeah, I guess my touchstone for this though is thinking about actors and that whole sort of rehearsal process, and the idea that the actual run of the play is not really more determinate than the process that led up to it.
We have some questions. First one from Jeannie Manzi, and I'll read it off to you, Philip. I've now seen the same art piece in two different spaces. Because the museums are different, the screens and orientation are laid out differently. What does it look like to install a piece like this and preserve the essence of the performance? Maybe that's a question for both of us. I don't know, but would you like to tackle it first?
Well, I guess I'm not sure I understand what is meant by the essence of the performance, in a sense. I mean, as if that's some invariant thing that has to happen in every space that the piece appears in, even though the piece has to inevitably be reconfigured differently in different spaces. So maybe there is no essence of the performance. Maybe the performance is what it becomes, right, in each space, given the way that it's installed in that particular space. And so that the nature of the performance is not essential, but more sort of contingent. I mean, obviously there are things about it that are invariant, but what happens on the screens doesn't change. But still, yeah, I'm not necessarily certain that we need to think about this in terms of there being some essential thing that's there that always has to be there. Maybe it's more contingent on the circumstances in which it's shown.
Right, and there are specifications that the artists in the studio provide for the installation. So while there are variations and contingencies, at least over the last several years, it's been installed more or less in the same configuration. I think in terms of sort of the idea of essence, one essential part of the exhibition, the installation, is the also the performance of the audience, and you touched on that a little bit. Not interactivity, but the how the audience responds to it, how their feet help them to hear and see it, walking in and among the screens, and to become a spectator of spectators as a member of the audience, to me, seems to be a part of the essence of the installation.
Yeah, well, when I saw it, what I was struck by, I mean, it may in a way have been something I was seeing that may not really have been happening in a sense, but at the end of it, when there's all this kind of festivity happening on the screens, it seemed to me that the people in the room were also becoming much more festive. I mean, partly because it was ending, I suppose, but they were speaking more loudly, they were engaging more with one another, and so there was this kind of I don't know, parallel in a sense between the mood that was being created in the performance and on the screens and the mood in the room where the people were looking at it.
Right, and so for me as a curator, that part of the performance is important to preserve in terms of the mechanics of installing it. But next question is from Jay Bolter. Could you reflect further on the relationship between liveness and mediation in the visitors? I'm thinking of your landmark work on that concept, in parentheses, liveness, in liveness performance in a mediatized culture.
Well, I mean, I think the live, as Michael was just kind of saying in a way, the liveness of the visitors is located in the audience, right? I mean that's the live component of it, and particularly in a piece like this, which is relatively variable. I mean, always you kind of construct your own experience of the mediatized component of it through the way you move through it, And you hear one musician more than another, or you can kind of construct your own mix of the sound, etc. So in that sense, it's not as static in a way as a simple sound recording or something like that would be, because you as the spectator, the live element, right, have the ability to kind of make the recorded element, or you have some degree of ability to make the recorded element into what you want it to be, right, or at least to choose your own kind of path through it. So I think that's where the liveness of this really resides, and is different in that respect from just a straightforward recording of the same musicians performing the same music, because that wouldn't necessarily have the same, wouldn't be as open to variation according to your particular interaction with it.
This question from Clive Cass: do you think the repetitive nature of the works create a hypnotic effect that hooks the viewer into not wanting to stop listening and not wanting to stop watching the performances?
I think that is true to some extent for this piece, The Visitors. I actually don't think it's true for most of Kjartansson's work. I don't find it hypnotic at all. What I wrote about in my earlier essay was, for me, and I'm not trying to suggest that my experience is universal, but for me, what really stood out I mean, first of all, The Visitors at just over an hour is a short piece, relatively short piece, although God is only 30 minutes. And it's not as repetitious. I mean, God is one line over and over and over again for 30 minutes, right? So it's not as repetitious as many of his works are. And I think this, even say, if you want to talk about sort of hypnotic quality, I think there is something lulling and soothing about the melody itself, and not even necessarily the repetition of it, just the melody itself to which the poem has been set. So, but I do think, yes, and I think this particular piece does have some of that quality. But for me, looking at some of his other works involving music, they actually are much more about the individual iteration. Okay, so each time he says, sorrow conquers, sorrow conquers happiness. I don't actually hear that as just a kind of flow of this thing over me. I hear it as a series of discrete elements, right? Each line by itself, in a sense. And so, yeah, so for me, much of the work has more to do with the particular identity of each individual iteration of the thing that is repeated, and not so much about there being a kind of lulling flow that's created through the repetition.
And I think there is, in The Visitors, there is a linearity in the song, but in that the entire poem is sung throughout from the beginning to the end of the song. It's just that they take one or two lines from the poem, and those lines are repeated in between takes or in between repetitions, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's not, and the song as a whole is, it's a piece of music. I mean, it's constructed as such. It's not nearly the same thing as taking, 3 minutes of Mozart and doing them over and over again for 12 hours, right? We're not talking about, repetition of that kind or on that scale. The song itself is composed as as I said, sort of satisfying piece of music, right? It doesn't have that kind of sense of being a piece of something being repeated over and over again.
Right. And not to harp on or rather overplay this idea, but I'm also struck by the development of the performers in the piece, how they develop emotionally. I mean, at one point, it seems like the rest of the performers are singing for Kjartansson, who is silent, and I don't think he's doing anything. He's not playing the water. He's not playing his instrument. He's simply it seems to be in a meditative state, but all of the characters, or all of the performers rather, tend to have a development over the course of the piece that's really fascinating to watch, an emotional kind of development, perhaps.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I'm not sure I think that's true for all of them, but it certainly is observable. And so, and I think that, I think that's part of the experience of playing music, frankly. It's that sort of progressive absorption into the music, kind of, feeling it as you're playing it, and that does change over time. So yeah.
We have a question from Anne, and I'm not quite sure I understand it, so I'm going to just ask you if you want to clarify it. Anne writes, I was puzzled by the visual distortions. Was this an homage to Carnival Funhouse? I don't know what you mean by distortions, unless you do, Philip. So if perhaps, Anne, you could clarify that for us, we'll get back to you. Peter Temko has a comment and a question, I think, for me. We are elderly, we're fascinated and delighted by this piece at the High. Would it be disturbing to the integrity of the piece if small seats in view of the various screens were installed so some of us could attend the entire duration? We loved it. Yeah, that's a good question. It's a difficult question because I've seen it installed 3 or 4 times since it was produced, and it has never had seating installed in the space. It's such a powerful work, one of the most important works of video art in the last 20 years, in my opinion, that I thought long and hard about including seats in the space. There's certain practical things to think about when including seating in a dark space. For one thing, it can provide, or can present rather, a hazard for people because of the low light levels. But more to the point, more to your point, I think it does disturb the integrity of the piece because of the relationship between the installation of the work and the audience and the idea of movement. That it is, as Philip mentioned in his talk, it's as much a sculptural piece, it's as much a sound sculpture as it is a work of media, in my opinion, and the importance of navigating between and among not only the screens but also the channels, the sound channels, is important. And so, I wouldn't want to discourage people from doing that, and to encourage them from staying in one place. And I haven't asked the studio or the artist this question, but I would be fairly certain that this would not be something that would be desired by the artist. What do you think, Philip?
Well, I actually am sympathetic with both positions. It's difficult for me to stand for long periods of time. So I actually do like to have a little respite from that. On the other hand, I totally understand what you're saying about wanting to encourage people to move through it, which is so much a part of what it's about. So yeah, it is a dilemma because there are people who do need to be able to sit down once in a while and can't stand for a full 64 minutes even if they want to. So I do think that some kind of consideration should be made for that, but at the same time, I understand what you're saying as well. So it's a tough question.
One compromise we made was, because there is a gallery adjacent to the video installation, we put benches in that space. And the idea of doing that was in response to this question. And we had this question we considered this question for several weeks. And the thought was, well, if we provide the opportunity to rest in this one space, you can still hear at least a lot of loud moments in the performance in that space and rest up. That's something. It's not the same, I know, and I agree. I'm totally sympathetic, and perhaps it's something that we consider in terms of making those little stools that we have available for our docents and for tours. So I'm totally sympathetic, Peter, and I agree with you that it's difficult to stand or sit on the floor, for that matter, if you're someone like me with bad knees, and get out for 64 minutes. I don't see any new questions, so maybe we can, are there any closing thoughts, Philip, that you have?
Oh, I don't know. I think I kind of gave you my thoughts there.
You did. You certainly did. Well, I do. I have a question, maybe, or not a question, but rather an observation. And that's, I think I think it's an incredibly powerful work and important work. One of the most powerful moments for me is when all the performers are absent, when there is an absence and there's still sound, there's ambient sound, and you can hear them singing as they march off into the landscape. But there's a palpable absence of their bodies in these spaces, whether it's an unmade bed, which recalls, Felix Gonzalez Torres, or a settee, a piano. And that's analogous in a way to the idea of silence. David Cushon, I think, touched on it just a little bit in our conversation, but what to you in terms of the musical aspect of this piece, what is the importance of like the idea of silence, or no, not necessarily silence, but no music? The rests, I guess, and musical rests.
Yeah, well, it just so happens, I mean, I don't want to take you down this path, but just so happens that one of the next things I'm thinking about and speaking about is John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which is ostensibly silent, but of course it isn't. And I think that, I mean, I don't recall precisely, but it seems to me that at the end of The Visitors, the fade of the people, going down the grassy area is very, very slow. So there is actually, you keep hearing them for quite a long time. And I don't know, is there really a moment at which you stop hearing that, or you don't hear anything on the screens? But yeah, the absence of music. I mean, this may be a little bit, it's not about music, but it may be a little strange sounding, but and partially because this made me think so much about 19th century, that the ending actually reminded me in a lot of ways of the ending of Chekhov's play, The Cherry Orchard. And what happens at the end of The Cherry Orchard is that this whole family, it's a large Russian family, troops off the stage, all going off to a better life, or at least they think. They're going off to a better life in Moscow, and they leave behind one guy, this old servant, and they essentially have forgotten about him, and he's fallen asleep. And at the very end of the play, if I remember correctly, the last thing that happens in the play is he kind of gets up and says, "Where am I?" essentially. And I was kind of thinking about that one guy that's left at the end, right? That one technician. Everyone else is off running around having fun, and then there's still this one guy that they've left behind to take care of things, and so that was kind of how I took it. It wasn't so much about their absence as about his continued presence, right? That even though they've all gone off, to this wonderful festive mood, and that also does have to do with, there is a lot of stuff, but I mentioned it very, very briefly, but I didn't really get into it. But there's a lot of stuff about the materiality of making something like this built into it. I mean, first of all, the fact that you can see the equipment at all times.
Right.
You can see the microphones, you can see the amplifiers. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's, that's necessary. Of course, you can't see the cameras, but and the mere fact that it does begin with someone turning on all the cameras and then turning them all off speaks to an aspect, the labor of production that's involved in making something like this. And I think that's an element of it as well. The talent gets to run off and have fun, but there are still people who have to stay around and take care of the equipment, right? So that's really more what I found myself thinking. It was not, as I said, not so much about their disappearance as about the fact that someone is left behind, right? And that there's still things that need to be done, in a sense.
One of the things that you can see also in most of, or maybe half of the vignettes is the musical score, the graphic score, and it's laid across to the left of the drummer, I believe, and it occurred to me that there's visuality is really important in this piece, and as it is in I think all of Kjartansson's work. He pointed out the relationship between art historical sources, or and that there are so many different sources, or rather quotations, that as a person who's more visual than I am oral, can pick out. And the most prominent, of course, is the Rugby Venus and the quote to the farm. But from Rugby Venus all the way up through, as I mentioned, perhaps Felix Gonzalez Torres. There are the two portraits of the Duke of Urbino and his wife on the mantle behind the guitar player in the bedroom. Anyway, there are so many different visual layers to this piece that I've add so much richness to me as an audience, as a member of an audience, and trying to piece these things together. And as you say, not only mix the sound for myself, but also kind of mix the kind of visual landscape of it together myself.
Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, that was when I was thinking about that piece in the Rockies. I mean, I was really struck by just that kind of, reiteration of that spectacular landscape, which ends up looking like a painting, is in I think is in reference to a certain kind of painting. But yeah, I mean, and I think that's again one of the nice things about his work is this kind of bringing together of art historical references on the one hand, and kind of pop cultural musical references like the ABBA thing, which it's interesting to me that I wanted to talk about that partly because it sort of gets mentioned a lot without anyone ever really thinking, well, what does it mean? How does it work? And when I saw the cover of the ABBA album, I was really struck by how much it looks like Rokeby, and this kind of 19th century interior that's common to both places. And so that I thought that was that's kind of an interesting, and the fact that album is partly about schism, and that's some of that certainly in the Visitors as well. So you've got ABBA and you've got Rokeby Venus side by side, and I think that's one of the things that makes it wonderful.
We have one last question, and it's from Deanna Serlin, and that's to me. Michael, did you decide to bring the work to the high at the beginning of the pandemic, since it has indeed had a powerful meaning during this time? And no, I wish I had that kind of oracular power, but if I had, I would have sent out warnings to everybody. But we decided to borrow this work from the collector in Dallas, because we are trying to do more video and media installation at the museum. And we've done one of the most important, I think, media installations, sound installations, and that was the Janet Cardiff that you showed, Philip. And in my opinion, this is exactly analogous in terms of the power of it and the way it functions as a sound sculpture. So the leadership in the museum and I considered bringing this piece to the museum as in between the larger, more sprawling exhibitions that occupy that floor. And as it turns out, it has this incredible resonance with this past year, which is emotional. I've seen people I mean, I'm kind of a lurker in the galleries. So Philip, if you see me lurking in the galleries, I'm watching how people respond to work and how they interact with work, and I learn from that. And sometimes I'll interact with them, like with the Janet Cardiff piece. I remember once a woman, unprovoked, we just locked eyes, and she gave me a big hug. She was in tears, because she just needed to do that. And I've seen people in the Kjartansson piece also become emotional, and you can't help it. But anyway, I don't know if I probably didn't answer your question adequately, Deanna, so apologies. But I think this has brought us to the end of our program. Philip, thank you again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And to all of you who joined us tonight, thank you for joining us. I might add, you can join us on the 4th of May, same time. You can tune in for a program titled Wine, Art, and What's Next? Kevin Tucker and Andre Mack. But until then, from all of us at the High Museum, have a good night, and thank you again. Philip, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.